Page 142. Through the Centuries. Canada's History. Canada's history is a series of stories. They trace the development of the land from a wilderness to a wealthy, culturally diverse region. The story of Canada begins thousands of years ago with the earliest people. Canada's earliest people. Most experts believe that the earliest people came from Asia in two separate migrations, or movements. The first may have taken place at least 25,000 years ago, when people crossed a land bridge that once connected Asia and North America. Over thousands of years, these people and their descendants, or children's children, are thought to have spread out all over North America and South America. Those who came to live in what is now Canada became known as Native Canadians, or Canada's First Nations. The second migration of people may have taken place about 5,000 years ago. These people settled Canada's most northern regions. Their descendants came to be known as the Inuit. Today, descendants of the Inuit still live in the Arctic Islands region. Many speak their ancient language and follow traditional Inuit culture. Although the Inuit remained a single culture society, the other Native Canadians formed hundreds of different cultures. Each had its own way of life. Groups of them, however, shared common environments and common natural resources. Some Native Canadians settled in the thick forests of the Appalachian region, the St. Lawrence lowlands, and the southern Canadian Shield. These people included Algonquins, Hurons, Iroquois, Ojibways, and Ottawas. They spoke different languages and followed different customs, yet they shared a common natural resource: trees. These people used wood and tree bark to make shelter and light boats called canoes. Traveling in the canoes on the region's many rivers and lakes, they interacted with one another through trade. Unlike the eastern regions of Canada, the interior plains had few trees. Instead of a forest, there was a vast prairie. The people living on the prairie, such as the Assiniboines and the Blackfeet, developed different cultures, but they all came to depend on the same natural resource. To meet many of their basic needs, the people of the interior plains hunted the huge herds of bison, or buffalo, that fed on the grasses and wildflowers of the prairie. The people used the meat of the bison for food. They used its skin for food and shelter, and other parts of the animal to make tools and weapons. Native Canadians living in what is now Western Canada relied on the ocean and the region's thick forests for their natural resources. People such as the Haidas and Nootkas used cedar trees to build their shelters. The trees also provided wood for building large dugouts. Dugouts are boats made from large, hollowed-out logs. In their dugouts they hunted whales, sea otters, and other ocean animals. Native Canadians also settled the vast northern Canadian Shield, where the Chippewyans, Crees, and other groups lived a harsh life. In land too cold to farm, they relied on hunting small animals. Further north, in the Arctic Islands region, lived the Inuit. Because there were no trees with which to build shelters, the people lived in tents made of animal skins or in houses made of earth. When traveling in search of animals to hunt, they built houses out of snow as temporary shelters. Like the Native Canadians living in the Canadian Shield, the Inuit found ways to use every part of the scarce natural resources they had. They made tools, weapons, and artworks from the animals' bones, antlers, horns, and teeth. The French and the British. The first Europeans to arrive in what is now Canada were Vikings. Long ago, Vikings lived in what are today the countries of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. In about AD 1000, they crossed the Atlantic Ocean and landed in what is today Newfoundland. The Vikings stayed briefly and did not establish permanent or long-lasting settlement. Nearly 500 years passed before other Europeans arrived. In the late 1400s and early 1500s, explorers sailing for England and France came. These two European countries would prove to be important in Canada's history. In 1497, an Italian explorer named Giovanni Cavato claimed for England what is now Newfoundland. In 1535, French explorer Jacques Cartier sailed inland on the St. Lawrence River. In claiming the northern land for France, They used the Iroquois word Kanata, meaning group of huts, to describe it. It became Canada. Unlike the English, the French sent people to live in the land they claimed, which they called New France. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain started the first permanent French settlement in what is now Canada. It was located along the St. Lawrence River and was named Quebec. The French ruled New France for more than 150 years. Then in 1754, a war began between the French and the English, who were also called the British by this time. The war was called the French and Indian War. It is also known as the 7 Years' War. It started in North America, and the fighting soon spread to Europe. In 1763, the French and British ended the war and signed a peace treaty. The treaty gave the British control of New France, which they renamed Quebec. The British ruled Quebec as a colony. Far more French people than British people lived in Britain's new colony. Britain was already having troubles with its 13 American colonies in what is now the United States. To avoid still more trouble in North America, the British passed a law called the Quebec Act. It gave the French people in the British colony the right to keep their own laws, their own language, and their Roman Catholic religion. While the Quebec Act pleased many in Canada, it angered the American colonists in the 13 British colonies to the south. They thought the law gave the French more freedom than they had. In time, the angry feelings between the colonists in the 13 American colonies and the British led to the American Revolution. In 1776, the 13 American colonies rebelled against British rule. The British government watched to see if the people in Quebec would join the revolution. They never did. Most French people felt Britain showed in the Quebec Act that it would govern them fairly. Becoming a nation. From 1780 to 1850, Canada grew both in population and size. During this time, more English-speaking people began moving there. Some came from Britain. Others came from the American colonies. These Loyalists, as they were called, have remained loyal to the British during the American Revolution. Many Loyalists settled in Quebec. Others settled in a part called Nova Scotia, or what the British called Acadia. Soon the Loyalists in Nova Scotia demanded a colony of their own. In 1784, the British gave half of Nova Scotia to the Loyalists. This half became known as New Brunswick. Loyalists in Quebec soon wanted their own colony too. So, in 1791, the British divided Quebec into two colonies, Upper Canada and Lower Canada, each with its own government. English-speaking Canadians made up the majority in Upper Canada, which later became known as Ontario. French-speaking Canadians made up the majority in Lower Canada, which later became known as Quebec. By the mid-1800s, many Canadians worried that the United States might expand into Canada. To strengthen their separate Canadian colonies, the British, on July 1, 1867, approved a law setting up a single Canadian government. This government was made up of the former colonies, which were now called provinces. By the British North America Act of 1867, as the law was called, Canada became the Dominion of Canada. A dominion is a self-governing nation. The new Dominion of Canada, however, was not totally independent. The British continued to rule over foreign matters. The British monarch also continued to act as head of state. As Canada grew, more provinces were added to the Dominion. In 1869, Canada purchased from the Hudson Bay Company a vast region it had called Rupert's Land. From it, the provinces of Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan were later formed. In 1871, British Columbia was formed and joined the Dominion. Prince Edward Island joined in 1873. Newfoundland became Canada's 10th province in 1949. As their country grew, Canadians felt a growing sense of nationalism. Nationalism is a devotion or loyalty to one's own nation or country. The people began to think of themselves as Canadians. Nationalism also helped unite the British and French cultures that in time formed what became Canadian society. In 1964, the Canadian government chose a new national flag, which first flew on February 15, 1965. It was an important event for Canadian nationalism. The country had long used British national symbols on its flag. The new flag now showed Canada's unique identity. Finally, in 1982, Canada's independence was complete. Canada received total authority over all of its government matters when the British government approved the Constitution Act. The Constitution Act also included a new Bill of Rights called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.